Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends, and the foes out there. Welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Dilly Hussain. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to remind all the avid podcast listeners that you can find this episode on all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky. Do remember to click subscribe to the Five Pillars YouTube channel. Today's guest is joining us from Minneapolis in Minnesota in person. I'm honored to have her on. This podcast was in the making for some time. She's the director and founder of the US-based news outlet Mint Press, which covers Middle Eastern, North African and Muslim current affairs. And that's none other than Sister Mnar Adley. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me.
Honored to have you on. How often do you visit the UK?
Well, I've been here, I think, almost every year for the past 3 years. It's an honor to be here, and I always love coming here to visit.
And how does it differ from your neck of the woods in Minneapolis or Minnesota? I love a big Somali community there.
Yeah, we have the highest population of Somali refugees and Iraqi refugees in the state of Minnesota, and I think it's because our state likes to puts the refugees to work.
Okay. How long has Mint Press been around?
Mint Press has been around for nearly 15 years now. It's my baby, and I'm very proud of some of the accomplishments that we've made at Mint Press. We're one of the leading independent media outlets in the United States that has an eye on the U.S. military machine, and we do things a little bit differently at Mint Press. We investigate stories based on our First Amendment, which is really rare to find today in a sea of propaganda lies that is being led by the mainstream corporate media apparatus in the United States. And so we put an eye on the military machine. We investigate how think tanks draft the war policies and how that in turn, how they in turn work with media outlets to manufacture consent for U.S. Military adventures abroad.
We'll speak more about Mint Press for sure. And yourself and perhaps a bit about what you were doing before Mint Press. But as a journalist and as someone who's in the field of, news and current affairs pertaining to the Middle East and North Africa, especially Palestine and its occupation, can I ask you a list of other news outlets? And I just want to get your thoughts on them. As in, like, they're quite popular in the English language. Let me know if you know of them, if you follow them, if you have any comments about them. They could be competitors. I don't know, Yani. I'm just want to get your thoughts on it. I do this to the guests all the time. Mondo-wise.
Good.
Grey Zone.
Great.
Electronic Intifada.
Incredible.
Plus 972.
Good.
Quds News.
Very good.
Middle East Monitor.
Good.
Middle East Eye.
Good, but they have promoted some NATO wars in the past.
Now, I have to break up the following to 3 categories because they're 3 arms, and editorially they're very different. So I want to get your thoughts on Al Jazeera English.
Good, but very pro-NATO.
Al Jazeera Arabic.
A little bit better.
AJ Plus.
I would say the same as Al Jazeera English.
Very succinct and on-the-point answers. I was expecting elaboration, but you knew pretty much most of them. These are very outspoken outlets, and mashallah, I find a lot of them do good work. And but on to Mint Press. You're full Palestinian, right?
I'm 100% Palestinian.
And before we started filming, you said you actually lived under occupation for some years of your childhood, right?
I did. I lived under Israeli occupation from the ages of 9 to 13. Although I was born and raised in the United States, I grew up in the pristine suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And my parents decided, they wanted to expose us to the culture, to learn the language, and of course to learn more about our religion, Islam. And so my parents moved us back. They packed up our bags when I was about 9 years old to Al-Quds. And it was one of the most life-changing experiences that I have been through. You cannot unsee what you see when you go to Palestine. If you were just to be there for one day, you would be completely devastated by the fact that you're living under an Israeli apartheid system, a settler colonialist state, the blatant racism, the control of movement of Palestinians, the control of water, electricity, I experienced all of that in those 4 years. And when the Intifada had broken out when I was about, 12 and a half, almost 13 years old, it became unbearable for us as an American Palestinian family. My dad couldn't find work. He couldn't support us any longer. And so we had to move back to the United States. But it was major human rights abuses that I had witnessed in this very formidable age, where you kind of start to understand the world around you. I had my water cut off. We had to barricade our home at one point because Israeli settlers were attacking Palestinians. They were planting bombs in elementary schools. I sat on my rooftop in Shafat, Jerusalem, and watched Israeli jets drop bombs on homes in Ramallah. It was very nearby. And you think, like, how could anybody just sit on the roof of their home and watch these bombs being dropped? But that's the daily life of Palestinians. And I had to go through checkpoints, militarized checkpoints. I've had family members kidnapped by Israeli soldiers, abused, returned with their heads shaved off and, their body full of bruises. It was a very traumatizing experience. And when I moved back to the United States when I was about 13 years old, I felt very alone, and I suffered from severe PTSD and anxiety. And I had come back to the American society almost in culture shock, because I went from life being about survival as a Palestinian to coming back to a very calm life where teenagers in my 8th grade class were worried about, sex, drugs, or, what latest brand they were going to wear. And they had never heard about Palestine. They didn't even know where to point to it on a map. And it was just such a traumatizing experience. And I remember a couple of months after we had moved back from Palestine, September 11th happened. And I was sitting in my classroom watching the media, again, beat the drums of war after September 11th. And I actually witnessed CNN plant a story of Palestinians celebrating Eid in Gaza. And they had planted that story
as they were celebrating 9/11.
As they were celebrating 9/11. And I remember kids in my class pointed to me and said, see, your people did this. Look how happy they are that we suffered 9/11. And even months before 9/11, I had witnessed the media portray the crisis in Palestine and Israel as an equal level playing field. It was through a religious lens. It was Muslims versus Jews, never through the lens of colonialism or occupation. And so these instances and exposure to how the mainstream corporate media worked to beat the drums of war and to paint Palestinians as inhumane, as subhuman, as barbaric, really led me to point to the media as a means of, it's the media's fault for manufacturing consent for U.S. support for Israel. And also, after 9/11, I witnessed how the media used women, Palestinian women, Afghani women, women in Iraq, that need to be liberated. So I watched one by one the mainstream corporate media beating the drums of war and how they just pushed lie after lie to promote U.S. support for Israel, U.S. Support for these military adventurisms, to promote the war on terror, to go into Afghanistan and Iraq, 2 horrific wars that resulted in 1 million deaths in Iraq and 1 million deaths in Afghanistan or more, and a refugee crisis.
For sure. In terms of those experiences, would you say that's what led to Mint Press, or you pursuing a career in journalism?
It was at 13 years old that I pointed to the media from those instances and exposures that I realized it was the media that was manufacturing consent for these wars. And I decided at 13 years old to write an essay for my junior high class that I wanted to be a journalist.
MashaAllah.
To, build bridges, not just expose the war machine, but also to build bridges and show, who Palestinians are, who the people are that are living under the boot of U.S. Colonialism and imperialism and these bombs, because it was the media that was always dehumanizing the victims of our wars, while also using women, of course, like us Muslim women, they need to be liberated. We don't need to be liberated. We are, intelligent, independent women that can speak for ourselves. And so I kind of felt like I needed to be in the media, be the media, be the voice of Palestinians, be the voice of these Muslims who have lived under occupation and war, and start Mint Press. Of course, Mint Press was born when I was 24 years old, but it was out of this passion. And so I used my trauma, that anxiety, that PTSD, and I turned it into this courage, this fire beneath my feet to pursue journalism. And at the age of about 19 years old, I decided to wear the hijab. And I was the first person to wear hijab in my family, actually. And, you know, I became the first American woman to wear the hijab to anchor and report the news. And I actually did work in corporate media and local news.
What was that like?
It was not satisfying at all. Because
it's not, is it?
No, it's a different ball game.
It's boring. It's lifeless. I can see its importance because I worked at an equivalent called the local paper. And there's only so much potholes and council tax and local council meeting stories you can cover. I don't think that was our calling, to be honest.
And that's exactly what I experienced. I mean, the local library was being, you know, I had to report in the local library. Like, these are good stories, important stories, but it just wasn't what I wanted to talk about. And so, yeah, after that, I started Mint Press right out of college.
Do you ever feel conflicted, or what do you say to those who would say to yourself or myself, or people who are either Muslim of immigrant descent, especially if you're Palestinian, that do you ever feel conflicted that you come to a country which gave you a safe space to then basically blast it and expose it and criticize it from within? Do you ever feel conflicted about that?
I don't feel conflicted. I feel privileged, to be honest with you, to be able to be an American, Palestinian, to have our First Amendment, which clearly defines the role of journalism, which is to act as a balance of power to the powers that be. Mm-hmm. It is to hold the government accountable for its corruption and mishandling of our taxes and so forth. And so I use this as an opportunity to expose how the United States is acting through its imperial, power to occupy the region. I mean, Israel acts as a proxy state for the U.S. military machine. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, two weapons manufacturers, they applaud all U.S. military adventurism in the region around the world. And every time a Palestinian child is killed, we see dead children, they see their stock prices go up. And so that's how the United States is fueled right now. It is through the military-industrial complex. And from the inception of the State of Israel, whether it's through the Balfour Declaration, the United States was there to arm and fund the Israeli terror state to colonize Palestine. And it's using Israel to control the region. That's just the truth.
Do you see the decline or the demise of the Zionist entity linked to a decline and demise in the US's global power in the region? Do you think it's interlinked?
I do think it's interlinked, and that's a really interesting question because the Israel lobby, which doesn't just make up AIPAC, but Zionist control of U.S. politics is overreaching and overarching. I mean, the tentacles of the Zionist control of our U.S. politics is extreme. It's in every facet of our society. And so that's why the United States right now is backing Israel's genocide in Gaza. They're not just handing Israel the weapon. I mean, they're leading the genocide in Gaza. They want to continue to support Israel, even though what Israel wants in the region is not necessarily in the interest of the U.S. government or even the U.S. military.
Is the demise of Israel in the region and the prosperity of the Arabs or the Muslims of the region, is it linked to the kind of, not downfall, but a decline and demise of U.S. power in the world?
Yeah, it is. Because, I mean, without Israel, the United States doesn't have a lot of power in the region. And we're seeing that also on the global stage with the rise of BRICS and more countries, removing, getting away from aligning themselves economically, militarily with the United States. And so the U.S. support for Israel is almost like its last standing grasp at global hegemony. Because not only does the U.S. have Israel's support, it has not all of, but the majority of the Arab and Muslim countries in the Middle East in their pocket as well. We saw that with the Abraham Accords when the United States sent, Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and Mike Pompeo across the Middle East to get countries like Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, to sign these so-called peace agreements. They were hailed as a peace agreement with Israel, but in reality, what this was an economic and military alliance against Iran. And Iran is a member of BRICS. And so that's really what it's all about, is that the United States has Israel to keep the Middle East in check. But we're seeing, a turning point in this movement, because Israel really shot itself in the foot with its war on Gaza, because it has united Muslims and Arabs alike across all religious lines, across all sectarian lines, because Palestine is a red line. Al-Aqsa is a red line. And so we're seeing the rise of the axis of resistance as well. And Israel is losing its grip on power in the region, while, the leadership in the countries of Morocco, Bahrain, the UAE, Egypt, and even Turkey, and, I call them the axis of assistance to Israel and the United States, those countries may align with Israel. The mass populations don't.
So I was going to ask you that. Why do you think the disparity is so massive between the general awam of the Sunni Arab world? And, you mentioned the axis of resistance. And I know you also said to me off camera, Diddy, I don't tend to see the politics of the region from a kind of a religious sense. I see it from colonialism and stuff like that. And that's absolutely legitimate way to see it, as sometimes they intertwine and they overlap. But Iran, predominantly Shia, Hezbollah, a Shia movement, the Iraqi resistance groups that are currently attacking Israel or targeting Israel, Shia, the Houthis, Shia. Why is there such a massive disparity between the populace of the Sunni Arab world, who are very much pro-Palestine, who are very much, see this struggle as one struggle, right? And they want to see more from their governments, let alone complicity and aiding and abetting. Why do you think that disparity exists in the Sunni Arab world?
Well, there's no question that religion does, play a role. I mean, you see these Shia countries that are supporting Palestine, they're supporting Palestine from a religious perspective. They're looking at this about Al-Aqsa. This is a Muslim cause. They look at this as a struggle for Imam Hussein. That's their perspective, right?
Yes.
These, the
kind of revolutionary call for is from that take of their history.
These oppressors are the same as Yazid. That's their perspective, right?
Yeah.
Now, we have that history too, as
Salahuddin al-Ayyubi and all this kind of stuff.
We have that perspective too, but the problem is that the United States made it very clear through a RAND report, okay? This is a think tank.
The infamous RAND report.
Yeah, the infamous RAND report that states that they are going to use Sunni countries to manipulate and push sectarianism against the Shia to control these Arab countries. And those are the Gulf Arab states. And so that's what the United States has done through creating these military alliances. They framed it as if we have to strengthen these countries to protect them from an expanding Iranian Shia influence, which is in fact not true. It's like flipping the narrative completely. It's not that Iran's influence is expanding. It's that the United States military is expanding its influence in the region to control these countries, to have them act as proxy countries, to serve the interests of Western imperialism. And what is Western imperialist interest in the region? It is to control the resources and economic growth in the region. I mean, look at Israel through the Abraham Accords. This economic alliance that it created with countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, for example, has seen Saudi Arabia and the UAE invest in Israeli companies that fund the Israeli military, providing the Israeli military with more weapons, with more military trucks, free meals for the IDF. It has allowed for countries like Egypt, who has dedicated 5 ports right now to export over $330 million worth of stuff for Israel, while Sisi government is blocking 5 miles of aid trucks to the Rafah border. So the Sisi government is actively starving Palestinians while providing $330 million worth of exports to Israel. And so we're just seeing, I mean, I could go down the list of countries of what each one is doing. We've got Morocco as well and the UAE. They both have built a subsidiary of Elbit Systems in their countries. Why? Because Elbit Systems is being targeted in countries like here in the UK.
By Pal Action
and so where are they going? To the UAE and to Morocco?
Your non-journalist hat off, and as an Arab, a Palestinian, a Muslim woman who is passionate about this cause, those list of complicity, and do you regard this as khiyana? As like a personal, individual level, do you see this as a level of treachery from brother nations?
Of course. You know, I don't see the leaders of Saudi Arabia though, and the UAE and Morocco and Egypt and Jordan as my brothers. I see them as traitors who have sold their souls to the devil.
Brothers and sisters and friends, I see that you're enjoying the content. How come you've not clicked subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel? And if you're watching via Rumble, how come you've not subscribed on our Rumble channel? If you like the content, you like the guests, you like what we're talking about, it's absolutely inexcusable and cheeky for you not to click subscribe. Thank you and Jazakallah khair.
The second you start working with the devil himself, you take that money, you take those weapons, you start creating alliances, you're working with evil. Mm-hmm. And you can hear the cries and the du'as, of the people in Gaza. They're begging for their Muslim brothers and sisters in these countries to help them. And those cries are falling on deaf ears by these nations. They're pretending to care about Palestine by giving us empty words of solidarity. Look at Queen Rania and King Abdullah, what they have said. The United States is acting hypocritical in its stance on human rights. But it's just projection about their own selves. Mm-hmm. They are providing Israel with an alternative land route for exports to go to Israel, specifically to protect Israel from the Red Sea blockade by the Yemenis. But it breaks my heart because the Arabs and the Muslims, the Palestinians, in Gaza, they have this belief like that somebody will help them. Somebody will help them from the Arab world. But look who is helping them. It's the poorest countries in the region that are being sanctioned by the U.S., that are being terrorized by the U.S., countries like Yemen, for example. We have these brave, brave men carrying their daggers, wearing their sandals, and Yemen is now the poorest country in the Middle East. Of course, it's an ancient civilization that's rich in history and rich in, minerals and so many amazing things about it. But Yemen has come to the rescue of Palestine by enforcing this Red Sea blockade, which has hit Israel with the biggest economic and military blow in the region. Mm-hmm. It's Yemen. And you hear the words of resistance leaders. They're not thanking Saudi Arabia. They're not thanking the UAE. They're not thanking Morocco for their assistance. They're thanking the axis of resistance for their assistance to resist Israeli occupation and genocide.
Linked to those groups and factions and countries that make up the axis of resistance, how challenging was covering the Syrian civil war and revolution for Mint Press?
It was one of the most complicated conflicts to cover because, as an American media outlet that tracks and traces, the U.S. military machine, we're looking at it from a perspective of what's the U.S. role here. And from the very onset of the Syrian war, we reported on how the CIA was funding and arming a lot of these rebel factions.
Can I ask you some questions?
You don't let me finish the end.
No, hold on, but it's linked to this.
Okay.
Do you believe that the call itself, the initial, cause of the non-violent protests, do you think that was something that was staged or planned?
Well, I think there's no doubt that there were legitimate protests in Syria. I think that that is real. However, those protests were not big enough to be called a revolution. And I think what happened is that, from our coverage, even from the days of the war in Iraq with ISIS taking over swaths of land, they announced that they were heading to Syria. They announced that they were going to fight and take down the Assad government, of course. And so from the very beginning, we saw these, rebel faction groups being formed, the CIA pouring money. We saw the Friends of Syria coalition being formed by countries like France, Great Britain, the United States, the Gulf Arab states, even Turkey, to form and fund and arm the Free Syrian Army, all so that they can overthrow the Assad government. And what we do know actually from the CIA is that through, I believe it was called Timber Sycamore program of the CIA arming the Syrian, rebels, David Petraeus at the time actually said that it was Benjamin Netanyahu himself that was pressuring the United States to keep sending weapons into Syria. And so we have a situation where the whole entirety of those protests were hijacked and turned into a movement to overthrow the government. There is no question about that. If we see the media right now with our bare eyes, and we are witness to how the media, whether it's in the United States or in the UK, blatantly lie and produce mass atrocity propaganda about what is happening in Gaza, in Palestine, in Israel, to manufacture consent for the war there. Can you imagine how much they produced to promote a sectarian civil war in Syria, to drive mass public support for the United States to pump that country with weapons, to create that civil war? That's what happened. And I saw Muslims en masse fall for that sectarian narrative. I saw people use the whole anti-Assad, pro-Assad labeling. In reality, it wasn't about supporting Assad or being against him. It was simply just pointing out the fact that the United States was pumping millions of weapons into this country to make Syria into a failed state, the same way it did to Libya by overthrowing the Libyan government of Muammar Gaddafi. We were told these were revolutionary fighters, but a lot of these fighters were in alignment with Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, with ISIS. The Free Syrian Army can't even call themselves revolutionaries if they're taking money and arms from the CIA, because now you're working with the devil himself.
So just staying on Syria, because the case that you've presented just now, there'll be many critics that'll think, hold on, this is a usual kind of anti-imperialistic Kool-Aid, that kind of us the shilling Kool-Aid, that everything was the evil Americans supporting all these different Syrian rebel groups. And what they'll posit back to you is that at least some of them that are a bit more critically engaged on Syria and not necessarily seeing it entirely from the prism of sectarianism or intra-Sunni or intra-Muslim sectarianism, they'll say, look, Bashar and his father, their track record of human rights abuses and violently censoring and quelling, Islamic scholars, Islamic movements, it's well known. The way his shabiha, his thugs, his people that are loyal to his regime, they wreak havoc in Syrian society. Those who rose up, defected from the Syrian Arab army. Those who rose up initially were sons of Syria. Sure, the Free Syrian Army was linked to Turkey and other Western countries, right? NATO nations. For sure, Al-Nusra and other groups, it was linked to Iraq and other events happening there. But a lot of these men were Syrian. They were Syrian men who rose up to fight Bashar and remove oppression. Whether their cause was hijacked or not, were their deaths in vain? This was before the country had so many foreigners coming and fighting for these different groups from Europe and elsewhere, and from the North Africa and elsewhere. Initially, it was Syrians who rose up, and it's hundreds and thousands of Syrians that have paid the price for this. It wasn't the rebel groups that were bombing and barrel bombing and decimating entire towns and cities. That was Russia, and that was Assad. And that's what they'd posit back to you. What would you say to that?
I mean, I'm not here to defend Assad or what he did, because there's no question that the Assad government and military did respond with a heavy hand. But I'm not sure what they were supposed to do when it was fully aware and open that the United States was, arming this insurgency. And you have Al-Qaeda on the ground, and you have Al-Nusra Front, ISIS there. You have a major Western power like the United States, Western countries like Great Britain, France, Turkey, all of those countries, backing and arming these groups. What does that look like? That looks like a coup that's being fomented in the country. But they were doing it with sectarianism, and we have to ask ourselves, why was Israel treating a lot of these fighters in their field hospitals? Mm-hmm. Are we going to talk about that? Because that means that these fighters were on the side of Israel, and they were gladly being served and treated by Israel. Why has Israel bombed Syria over 1,000 times since the onslaught of this crisis? So I think people who are looking at it only from one perspective and not the bigger perspective of the region of why Syria was targeted, I think that is very immature of them, because they are falling for this Western agenda of overthrowing and toppling the Assad government. And, Saddam Hussein was no angel himself, right? Mm-hmm. But guess what? The United States toppled that government. They killed over 1 million people in that country. And so I'm only looking at it from the role of my government, the United States, and their military and what they did there. But the truth is that Syria has always been a target of the U.S. I mean, in every single military report, Syria has been a target, along with Libya and Iran and Lebanon, because of Hezbollah, of course. And the reason is because Syria acts as a pipeline for weapons to the resistance. I mean, there's no question about that. Now, if you're going to ask me, is Bashar al-Assad, great or whatever, I think that's an irrelevant question. I don't support Bashar al-Assad. He's not my president. I'm not Syrian to speak on that. But I do know that from speaking to many Syrians is that the United States now has effectively sanctioned Syria under the Caesar Act, which is completely devastating Syria's ability to rebuild the country. And then we have to ask ourselves, too, why is the United States occupying 1/3 of Syrian land right now where all the oil and gas is and all the resources is? This was never about revolution. This was never about freedom. Okay, this started with Obama and Samantha Power's humanitarian intervention propaganda to say, let's go bomb people to save people. Let's go arm these people to save people. It wasn't just Assad killed his own people. And these rebels weren't just fighting with homemade weapons. They were being armed by the most powerful country in the world, which is the United States.
Just kind of finishing up on Syria. I mean, look, Mnar, what you've presented there, it will upset a lot of Syrians. It will upset a lot of non-Syrians, a lot of Sunni Muslims who saw Syria's conflict, revolution, uprising, civil war, whatever you want to call it, from a particular lens, from a particular prism. And that was the wider context of the Arab Spring, right, where we saw tyrants falling. Ben Ali, Ali Abdullah Saleh, Mubarak, Gaddafi via NATO. There were hopes and aspirations for Bashar to fall. There were uprisings in Bahrain, which was violently quelled. And it was kind of within this kind of framing of a kind of revivalist hopes in the Sunni Arab world, where these tyrants or these regimes were falling and they were hopefully going to be replaced by something better, whether it was Islamic or not, but something better than what it was. And of course, Syria took a very strong sectarian turn very quickly. Have you never felt conflicted about that? As a journalist, as an editor of a media outlet, as a Palestinian, have you ever felt conflicted about how you reported or saw the Syrian issue, and what you saw was becoming quite mainstream or quite common in terms of how people saw the Syrian war?
No, I didn't, because I read the RAND reports and I read the think tank reports that stated specifically that they would use sectarianism to draw Sunni support for this war. And I saw it within my own family, who was majority Sunni, who also said, oh my gosh, this is, Sunnis killing, or Shias killing Sunnis, and we have to go, and this, I've heard it all because it happened within my own family. But those are just emotional reactions and responses. Where were all those people when the people of Bahrain were protesting against their government and there was a complete media blackout against their protest movement? They were in Arab Spring as well, but because they were Shia, we saw the majority of Sunnis not even mention Bahrain. Where were our Sunni brothers and sisters when the people of Yemen were being bombed for over a decade and being succumbed to a blockade that left 23 million people today that are still starving? Where have we been as a community, as an ummah, as Muslims? I refuse to play the Sunni Shia card because it is more important to me for us to unite as Muslims under the banner of breaking the chains of Western colonialism. And that's really where true liberation in the region will come. What version of Islam are these fighters even fighting for and pushing for? What kind of Islamic state were they trying to establish? Because the United States would only allow for an ISIS-like Islamic state, because look at who they have always funded and armed and provided the means to have power in the region. Look at what they did in Afghanistan. Look at what they've done in African countries and across, places in the Middle East. It is a Western-pushed version of Islam, which, by the way, is only going to fuel stereotypes about Muslims through this Islamophobic tropes that exist within our media. That's the version, that's the kind of Islamic state that the United States would allow to exist in Syria if it were to allow it to happen.
Now, let's go to the genocide in Gaza now. We're approaching 11 months in a week or so, approaching a year, more than 40,000 martyred. That number is believed to actually be much higher. Many more thousands injured, more than 90% of the strip decimated, inhabitable. And you've got an election around the corner in the US, and you've also got a magazine that you're holding. Why don't you show us the front page of the cover?
I have Kamala Harris, our so-called Democratic president-to-be.
Yeah.
She's being framed as the next Obama. And the reason I brought this magazine with me here for our UK audience is because this magazine cover depicts her in the same light as Obama was depicted in that famous Shepherd Ferry image of hope and change.
Yep.
And so she's being compared to Obama, even though just a few months ago, we were watching her in these interviews. She could barely put a sentence together, very similar to our current president, Joe Biden. Such a huge embarrassment. But she's basically being revitalized in the media. And she's been coronated as the president, by the Democratic Party, the presidential frontrunner. And, this idea that she stands for hope and change and women's issues. I remember they did an interview with her campaign. They said the number one issue for the Kamala campaign is IVF. IVF and abortion and women's rights issues and women's health issues. Meanwhile, this administration has provided Israel with every single bomb to target and destroy every single IVF clinic in Gaza, every single women's health clinic in Gaza. The women of Gaza are drenched in blood right now. The children of Gaza have been targeted. Of course, it's been a war against women and children in Gaza. So it's just a sick joke, the fact that the Democratic Party, which purports to stand for democracy, human rights, women's rights, liberalism, can try to revitalize anyone from the Biden administration. And of course, we don't really even have, not even really a two-party system in America. We have a one-party system that is ruled by money, by Zionist control, and weapons manufacturers that support both parties. But we're given an illusion of choice. It's like having to choose between Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. Which killing machine would you like?
For sure.
Which killing machine would you prefer?
Yeah. In terms of like, how much support do you think the Democratic Party has lost of the Gaza genocide? Because obviously at the recent Democratic National Convention, they blocked a Palestinian from speaking, whilst other representatives from other communities and minority groups were represented. How much loss do you think they've actually had in terms of support? Because you still have the likes of Mehdi Hassan, who kind of presents Kamala and the Democrats as the lesser of two evils. You have I believe Wahajat Ali, and other kind of like pundits who kind of are still framing the Democrats and Kamala as the lesser of two evils.
Well, those pundits, to be honest with you, are tools for the Democratic Party to pull Muslims into supporting the Democrats. Because Muslims, to be honest with you, in America, and Arab Americans and Muslims in general, have always been used and manipulated by the Democratic Party to vote for them and to keep them in power. But because of the United States and the Obama administration specifically for their support for Israel's genocide in Gaza, they've lost a lot of that ground support. And so we're seeing an unconfirmed movement, which is basically a movement of people who would normally vote Democrat. They're not voting Democrat, and they're maybe voting for maybe the Green Party or an alternative party. And so we're seeing the Democrats kind of panic. But even though they're panicking, they're still not putting Palestine at the forefront. And so that's why they're using people like Kamala Harris and kind of presenting her in this way that, you know, she represents hope and change and women's issues. And in reality, you know, the Democrats are going to continue to manipulate their Muslim base, by telling them that, you know, that the Trump administration, voting for Trump would mean voting for fascism. But in reality, both parties represent evil. And so I'm one of the people that would always argue that voting for evil, the lesser evil, is still voting for evil. And so it's really sad to see how this is unfolding in the United States. But it's also an opportunity because people like Jill Stein, who represents the Green Party, is also gaining a lot of support from the Muslim community. And, you know, she's Jewish, she's an older woman, but she's always been an advocate for Palestine. She's indeed, anti-Zionist. Yeah. She calls Israel an apartheid state. She says Israel's committing genocide. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of leader that we need. Of course, you know, I kind of lost a lot of hope in American politics, but that's the kind of person and leader that we need in America.
How do you feel as a Palestinian, as someone who identifies with the US, that this is essentially a country which is literally funding the genocide of my people? Is there a level of impartiality when it comes to covering news related to that? Because you're a human being, you're a Palestinian, you're a Muslim, and naturally when you're part of a country, whether it's you were born there or you identify from a point of view of citizenship, can those feelings affect the way you cover news? Like, you know, you said I'm American, and the US government is the same government that's literally funding, aiding, abetting, sustaining, strengthening, preserving the Zionist entity and occupation and the dhulm upon your people, our people. Does that affect the way you cover news? Can you even be impartial to that?
No, I can't be impartial. I mean, how can you be impartial when you're witnessing, you know, your tax money going to support an apartheid state? You know, I was blessed to go live in Palestine, to live in Al-Quds. And I was even blessed last year to go visit Palestine for the first time since I was 18. So just, you know, almost 18 years I had not been there. And so being an American, though, also gives me that opportunity to see things from that perspective of my government is doing this. Whereas if I just had lived in Palestine my whole life, I probably wouldn't have this opportunity to be in the West, to be in this privileged situation and circumstance where I do have a platform to educate other Americans about this issue. And so I see it as, you know, as a privilege to be able to do that. But of course, you know, I've always been juggling that identity crisis of, you know, I'm American, I'm Palestinian, and I've lived in America my entire life, and I do use my privilege to educate people. And that's all we can do, is just educate people, because Americans are the most propagandized people on the planet. We have 6 corporations controlling 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. We are living in a sea of lies in America. And so all I can do is just make sure that I treat people with kindness, with respect, with love, with empathy, even with people that I would normally disagree with. We want to make sure that we are able to speak to people, get on their level, to educate them about what's happening, not just in Palestine, but all around the world, to show the U.S.'s, tentacles, military tentacles that are overreaching, that are affecting the world through whether it's sanctions or actual bombs or supporting and arming coups, whatever it may be. Americans have no clue what their government is doing overseas. And so I look at it as a privilege to be able to do that.
Bringing the podcast to a close, and because we're talking about, trying to convince people, trying to get on their level, even empathizing and connecting with those that we may disagree with. One thing we've seen since October the 7th is a mobilization from millions of non-Muslims, especially across the Western world and the global South. They've come out in as many numbers as the Muslims, and new alliances, old alliances, and so forth. And there's always this conversation about who are the gatekeepers of the Palestinian cause. Is it an Islamic cause? Is it a cause against settler colonialism? Is it a cause for, is it a nationalist cause? Is it an Arab cause? Who are the gatekeepers? Who are the allies? Are the gatekeepers the Muslims? Are the gatekeepers the Arabs? Are the gatekeepers the socialists and those traditionally on the left? Who are our allies? Can the Arabs and Muslims have real, genuine allies on this cause in the hopes of liberation? There's always this conversation takes place, at least amongst Muslims. At least I've seen it. I've been in many circles where, I guess, out of despair, sometimes it comes from optimism, nostalgia, but also a level of despair. That, how many more need to die? How many more masajid are they literally waiting to demolish Al-Aqsa? Who are our allies and who are the gatekeepers? How do you see this? How do you see this as a Palestinian, in terms of what type of cause it is? Who are the gatekeepers and who are the allies?
Well, there's no doubt that Palestine is a human rights crisis that affects every single person, because the death of I shouldn't say the death. The murder of one innocent person is like murdering all of humanity. And so this is, with no question, a human rights issue, and it's a settler colonialism issue. It's a U.S. imperialism issue, and it's also an Islamic issue, because we have Al-Aqsa and Al-Ard al-Muqaddas. This is the Holy Land. This is the Holy Land that brings all religions together. And so it should concern every single person on this planet. The gatekeepers, I like to split the Middle East into 2 categories. We have the axis of assistance and we have the axis of resistance. And I think the biggest gatekeepers are the axis of assistance. And those are the Arab and Muslim countries that are not just sitting idly by, but they are actively complicit in aiding Israel in this genocide. And I mentioned those countries before, which are the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Turkey. They are actively aiding Israel in this genocide. And those are the gatekeepers of this crisis. Because if we look at countries like Yemen, I want to reiterate this point. The poorest country in the Middle East has enforced a Red Sea blockade. Okay, they've endured decades of U.S., Saudi, and UAE aggression there. Israel, by the way, occupies the islands of Socotra with the UAE, and they've built an intelligence hub there. But anyways, Yemen has itself hit Israel with the biggest blow. Just imagine if any of the other Arab countries that are the gatekeepers that I mentioned just took one action against Israel. This entire crisis would be over. In fact, Israel might not even exist if, let's say, even just Turkey alone cut off the oil supply that runs through their country from Azerbaijan to Israel, because Israel relies on 40% of Israel's energy relies on that one pipeline that runs through Turkey. Yep.
Hold up, the show will continue. But before it does, I want to remind you all that the Blood Brothers podcast is the fastest growing English language Muslim podcast in the world. When we deliver unique quality content to you week after week, brothers and sisters and friends, it requires money. So please click the link in the description and support this project however you can. Back to the show.
That one action would destroy Israel's economy and it would end the war right now, but they won't. And so who are the allies? Those are the countries that have been hit the biggest blows by the United States, by Israel, by Western powers. And those are Yemen, Lebanon, even Syria, and Iran. They have been sanctioned, they have been bombed, they have been targeted. Iran has not been bombed, but Iran, let's just take Iran for example. They have been hit with sanctions for over 60 years for the simple act of supporting Palestine and making Palestine their national cause. Okay? You can't say that about Saudi Arabia. They didn't make Palestine their national cause. They made Israel right now their national cause because of the Abraham Accords. Lebanon has been sanctioned as well. Their lira has no value at this point. They have no fuel. And it's because of Hezbollah's actions in defending southern Lebanon and defending Palestinians. Yemen is being bombed almost on a weekly basis by the British and by the United States right now because of their Red Sea blockade. Why is the United States putting so much effort to bomb Yemen because of that blockade when they could end that genocide? And of course, Iran, apart from being sanctioned, they have been targeted with assassinations, with smear campaigns. They have U.S. ships surrounding them. They have been flooded with refugees to destroy their economy. They have been accused of developing nuclear weapons, even though that's, just not true. During COVID, they were blocked because of sanctions from importing masks and vaccines. I mean, the Iranians have been targeted the most, all because of its support for Palestine. And who did Netanyahu mention the most when he addressed Washington, a couple of months ago? He mentioned Iran over 25 times during his speech. And we just had, I think his name is Yitzhak Rabik. He's an Israeli general who just came out and said in an op-ed editorial in Haaretz and said that a war with Hezbollah and Hamas, if it continues for one more year, that this is going to collapse the entire state of Israel. And so those are who the allies are, and those are who the gatekeepers are. And I think anybody who cannot see this through the lens of U.S. and Western imperialism is really just not educated on the bigger picture of the region. And, we're seeing a shift. This is a turning point in Israel's history and in the United States history, where we're seeing a global tide of resistance, not just these countries that are, actively defending Palestine, but a shift in also people's consciousness and understanding of the crisis. People we didn't even know could be our allies are now standing up for Palestine. And we should welcome that, for the most part, because the more of us, the more united we are, the more stronger that we are as a united front for the cause of Palestine.
Sister Mnar, it was an honor having you on. And
Thank you.
Inshallah, next time you're in the UK, it'd be great to have a part 2 of this.
Yeah.
And try my best not to make it so Syria focused.
Thank you. It's okay. It's a touchy subject.
It is.
It's all
it
good.
is. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you, brother.
Brothers and sisters and friends, I hope you all thoroughly enjoyed today's podcast as much as I did. If you did, do remember to like this video, leave a comment and subscribe. And of course, you can find this episode on all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.